Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome into the show. Yet another episode of Crushing Fantasy Football. I am Bryce Lockridge, your host of the show. All right, guys, today I am going to get at you guys with 5 important lessons that we've learned in the early season. So these are things that I've noticed, and they're things that I wish I would have talked more about this offseason, but no time like the present, right? I'm going to go ahead and give you this list of 5 important lessons that we've learned so we can adjust the way that we play fantasy football going forward. All right, so I'm going to start right here with the first thing on my list, and this is something that I wish I talked about more this offseason, and that is I think going forward in fantasy, we need to avoid drafting running backs and investing high draft capital in running backs that don't have top-end speed, right? We saw it, or we've seen it in the past in fantasy, right, and we've already seen it early in the season. 2 running backs that really come to mind when I think of this are Najee Harris and Alexander Mattison, right? Running backs that are projected for big workloads and have the combination of size, talent, good vision, and everything, but don't have top-end speed, they lack big playability, and a lot of times they're gonna provide bust weeks for you, right? We already saw it in week 1 with Najee Harris. We've seen it in weeks 1 and 2 with Alexander Mattison. Running backs that are slow typically aren't going to provide those explosive weeks for you, right? Because speed is the ultimate thing that creates big playability in running backs. And so that's why you never see running backs sustain awesome fantasy production over time unless they have some good combination of size and speed. They at least have to have one of the two. But ultimately, to have a high weekly ceiling in fantasy, you want to draft running backs that run a 4.5 or better. And if they don't, a lot of times they're going to lack that weekly ceiling that you want. We're already seeing it with those 2 that I talked about, Alexander Mattison and Najee Harris. I really think that we need to avoid going forward running backs that don't have top-end speed. Obviously, it's very early in the season. I'm not saying that those 2 can't have a good year. And in fact, I still think they're going to be pretty good. But there's just no chance of them being top 10 overall running backs when they don't have that big playability due to having elite explosiveness. Next on my list is something that I want to talk about that kind of bit me this past weekend in fantasy, and that is we need to trust our gut if it really tells us to do something when it comes to making a lineup decision or a trade, right? So not to talk about Alexander Mattison again, but he is a very good example of what I'm about to talk about here. I had DeAndre Swift on my bench and Alexander Mattison plugged in as my starter at my flex in a standard league this past weekend. And I was thinking to myself, I don't think that Alexander Mattison can run the ball effectively against the Philadelphia Eagles, right? And he really didn't. He really didn't have a very good game at all, pretty much provided an absolute dud for fantasy. And I was telling myself I want to play DeAndre Swift because I know that the Philadelphia offensive line, along with DeAndre Swift's explosiveness, is going to create a potentially huge game for him, even against a pretty good Vikings run defense. So with that being the case, I was so close to playing DeAndre Swift, but the reason I didn't do it is because Alexander Mattison was ahead of DeAndre Swift in like everyone's rankings. You could look at any fantasy ranking platform. Alexander Mattison was ahead of DeAndre Swift in everyone's weekly rankings. And so I kind of pushed out at the last second and went with the consensus when my gut told me to play DeAndre Swift over Alexander Mattison. So if your gut really tells you something, don't worry about what a fantasy expert told you, what I tell you, what anyone tells you. If your gut tells you to play a certain player, it's probably for a reason, and you should listen to your gut. Next on my list is that projecting running back workload really early in the season especially, but really in the NFL in general nowadays, is incredibly hard to do. You know, we saw it in week 1 with Bijan Robinson, right? He's supposed to get all the work in the backfield. Tyler Algier outcarried him in week 1, right? David Montgomery significantly outcarried Jahmyr Gibbs in week 1. Now, granted, these guys are rookies. There's a very high likelihood that as we get further and further into the season, their workloads are going to go up significantly, right? In fact, I think a lot of us expect that to happen. We saw it with Breece Hall last year. So I'm not saying to panic on these players. I'm just saying that early in the season especially, it's very, very hard to predict what kind of workload a running back is going to see. So early in the season, when it comes to making your lineup decisions, I think that efficiency and explosiveness and big playability should factor more into your lineup decisions than projected workload, right? Because it's very hard to figure out what the projected workloads are going to be like, right? Nobody thought DeAndre Swift was going to have 28 carries last night. Even when I wanted to start him, I didn't think he was going to have 28 carries, but I did know that he had good big playability for this game because of the talent, because of the offensive line that he's running behind, because of having a dual threat quarterback that can run, essentially everything like that. So when it comes to projecting running back volume numbers early in the season, I think it's kind of hard to do, and we need to look at things more like efficiency and big playability and being in an explosive offense, really, as opposed to what kind of workload they're going to see, because that doesn't become more predictable until the season really progresses. Next on my list is when it comes to daily fantasy, right? I I mean, a lot of you probably already know this and probably already use this strategy, but when you're drafting daily fantasy teams like on Underdog Fantasy, it's incredibly important to not be afraid to have ridiculous exposure to some players. Now, when you're drafting your off-season teams on Underdog, you want to balance out your exposures. You really don't want to have more than 30% exposure or 35% exposure at the absolute extreme to any player. But when it comes to your weekly teams, don't be afraid to absolutely hammer players that you think have a really good matchup. Like, for example, last week on my Underdog drafts, I drafted a ton of Tyreek Hill, a ton of Tua, Justin Herbert, and Keenan Allen, and even Austin Eckler, because I figured this is going to be a really high-scoring game. And so I had 40% exposure to a lot of those players in my drafts, and it ended up working out well for me. So don't be afraid to have a ridiculous amount of exposure to certain players as far as your daily fantasy picks, because that's how you're going to gain an edge. You don't really have to balance your exposures as much as you do from a season-long perspective. When it comes to the daily fantasy, don't be afraid to absolutely hammer a certain player that's in a matchup you like. Like, for example, this coming week with the Chiefs and the Jaguars, I am hammering Trevor Lawrence, Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, Calvin Ridley, even Christian Kirk, because I think this is going to be a shootout-style game. Now, if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But if I'm right, then I'm going to have a lot of teams that end up near the top, right? So when it comes to your daily fantasy, don't be afraid to have too much exposure to one player. It's actually something that can give you an advantage. Next and final thing on my list is that, and I've seen this a lot in the past, couple of years, right? People, they just panic sell like crazy in weeks 1 through 3. They just do it. I mean, I already have people talking about wanting to trade A.J. Brown because of what they saw last night, wanting to trade Alexander Madison, wanting to trade, Jamar Chase. I mean, it's insane, right? I got Josh Jacobs in one of my bigger leagues where I didn't think I'd be able to. I sold Mike Evans and Khalil Herbert for Josh Jacobs. Now, can that be a good trade? Can that be a bad trade? It can go either way, but my team needed running backs, and I'm already absolutely loaded at wide receiver because I have Waddle, Jefferson, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. So I figured, hey, Mike Evans is on my bench. He's not even starting. I need a running back. So I flipped Mike Evans for Josh Jacobs and just threw in Khalil Herbert, and that's going to be a tremendous advantage to my team because I needed a running back. And the only reason that trade worked is because Josh Jacobs had a bad week 1, and Mike Evans scored a touchdown and saw 10 targets. So the bottom line is people panic sell like crazy in weeks 1 through 3. So I know that you might want to wait until you know more of what players are going to do, but these are the best weeks to trade early in the season. Weeks 1, 2, and 3 are the best weeks to trade because people panic sell like crazy. So make sure to take advantage of these things and try to execute some of your league-winning trades in weeks 1 through 3. All right, guys, I hope these lessons help. Make sure to use these things to help you, improve and continue to be better at fantasy football so we have a successful season. I will catch you guys later. Bye.